4001 by SCP explained, y'all.
SCP personnel with O5 approval.
Okay.
Access beyond this point for those with standard level 4 security is prohibited and may result in
got
termination
5, right?
of Foundation employment. Unauthorized visitors who survive the mimetic kill agent are detained and interrogated under truth-exacting mimetic agents.
Holy.
Dr. Herman Wright was used to high
imagine?
security protocols. He had been working with the SCP Foundation for several years
and
had dealt with specimens both terrifying and valuable.
Herman Wright.
But something about this site was different. The security was tighter than he'd ever seen.
Okay.
And it all seemed a bit too much for what looked like a run-of-the-mill warehouse in Alexandria, Egypt. The street seemed normal.
Ancient
it was surrounded
Egypt
by
was
businesses
always
selling
cool.
food and clothes. And none of the locals
Lots
seemed
of
to give a
old
second
school
glance.
mythic
But as
lore,
soon as he
you
was
know?
approved for access
Like
and entered
legends
the
and stuff.
warehouse, it was a very different story.
Okay.
He looked
What was
into
in
the
warehouse?
cognito-hazard testing screen, designed to cause psychic damage to anyone who hadn't been inoculated by the Foundation.
Wow.
And entered the large bunker. Automated guns
The hell with a
lined
retina
the
scanner?
walls. He could see the outlines of trapdoors below him.
Right.
He was pretty sure the whole place was rigged to blow if a large-scale assault hit.
Dang.
The Foundation was taking no chance with whatever they had found in Egypt.
Right.
What could they be keeping locked
Were
up
there
below?
people that
As
were
Dr.
trying to
Wright
get
walked
to it?
through the long
I mean,
tunnel
we know
leading
there's
to the
rogue
staircase,
organizations.
he could see a series of rules marked on the wall. No open flames allowed within SCP-4001.
Okay.
No firearms or bladed weapons allowed within SCP-4001.
Okay.
All writing utensils brought into SCP-4001 must be approved by a majority of the O5 Council.
Dang.
Violating these conditions
It's
could
kinda
cause
like
a CK
prison
class
or,
restructuring scenario, or an XK class
what they do in
end
mental
of the world
institutions,
scenario.
keep people away from weapons.
Dr.
or
Wright's
things that can
mind
harm.
raced as he entered the massive antechamber and descended the staircase. But he wasn't prepared for what he saw. It was a library.
Right.
The biggest library he had ever seen.
Like the Library of
with bookcases
Alexandria.
stretched as far as the eye could see. The library was far bigger than the warehouse looked from the outside.
Okay.
And Dr. Wright assumed it must be a disguise built on top of the much bigger, older facility that had been discovered by the Foundation.
Is that an anomalous
It wouldn't be
property
the
of
first
it?
time the Foundation found something that didn't conform to the laws of Euclidean geometry. SCP locations often played by their own rules.
Right.
As Dr. Wright exited the staircase and walked up to the first bookcase, he could swear he heard rustling sounds among the shelves.
Uh-oh.
Was something moving? He hadn't seen anyone walking the aisles.
You
when he
didn't
descended
get
the
briefed on this,
staircase,
Doc?
And he was pretty sure he was alone here.
We didn't get briefed.
Making things stranger, a quick look at the bookcase didn't show any books he was familiar with.
Right.
None had standard titles.
Okay.
In fact, they all seemed to follow a simple format. Each title a different individual person. All books looked the exact same. Same binding, same thickness, same number of pages. Was this some sort of SCP reference library? Suddenly, a hand slapped down on Dr. Wright's shoulder and his heart nearly jumped out of his chest.
Can you imagine, bro?
He turned to see a gray-haired man in an SCP lab coat extending a hand to him.
Hey.
Dr. Waylon Henricks, Chief Scientist in
What up,
charge
Waylon?
of testing at SCP-4001.
All right. He's
You
the
must
big
be
dog.
Dr. Wright. He didn't give
That's
Dr.
what
Wright a
that's
chance
what the
to
tag
respond.
says.
Dr. Henricks didn't seem like the kind of man to be very interested in what others had to say.
He just wanted to talk.
About time the Foundation sent me a new research assistant. I suppose you have a lot of questions.
Wow.
Dr. Wright was supposed to be a researcher.
Yeah, not an assistant.
He didn't suppose it would do any good to point that out. When Dr.
Right.
Wright tried to question what it was that he'd be researching, Dr. Henricks told him that it would be easier to show than explain.
Okay.
With that, he motioned Dr. Wright to a nearby table, where one of the countless
Outreach
identical
hands,
books
man.
on the shelves was waiting. He nodded at the book, prompting the younger doctor to turn it over and read the title.
Okay.
He couldn't believe
Herman
what
Wright.
he saw. There on the front of the book was his name,
Right.
Herman Wright.
So.
Dr. Wright looked at his colleague in confusion, and Dr. Henricks motioned for him to take a look. It was written in a language that he had never seen before.
All
It
right.
was somehow instantly recognizable and understandable.
Weird.
And the book really was about him. Every detail of his life had been written down in this volume, starting with his birth, containing details that no one but he knew.
Right.
His whole life story was here.
No
From
wonder
his
the
childhood to
Foundation's
his
got it on
education
lock.
to his eventual recruitment by the SCP Foundation.
Talk about privacy
The book
issues,
wasn't
huh?
completed. The last line that had been written described his
That's
entry
against HIPAA
into the
laws.
secured confines of SCP-4001 that very day. Dr. Henricks had
What
a mad
the
glint
heck,
in his
dude?
eye. Are you starting to understand?
Yeah.
One for each of us.
A little
Every
bit.
person who has ever lived. Roughly 120 billion people since the dawn of man.
Wow.
Their lives all written down in these books. Every time someone is born, their book appears in this library.
Yeah.
Their story gets written as it happens.
And the library
The
just
Foundation has
keeps
been monitoring this
expanding?
site since the 1800s. But it's been operating much longer than that.
Right.
Since the dawn of recorded history. Dr.
What
Henrik's
the
past
heck,
Dr.
dude?
Wright another book.
The
It
Hunter.
was simply titled The Hunter, and it chronicled the life of a prehistoric man who spent his days searching for wild game.
Was that the first?
He lived 23
man?
violent, monotonous years before his story ended abruptly when a saber-toothed tiger decided it was interested in the same mammoth he was hunting. This must have been
Competition
one of the oldest
sucks.
books in the library. A book for every person on Earth.
That's
Dr. Wright could
nuts,
only
man.
imagine what the scale of this massive library must be.
Right.
Dr. Henrik explained that mapping the library was a huge challenge before producing a map from his
Well,
pocket
yeah.
and laying it out on the desk.
And
You're
it
at
always
base camp.
changes.
This is where new births generate on the shelves, along
Okay.
with books pertaining to the first humans. If you want to track down specific books, you'll need to know where you're going.
All right.
Establish base camps around the library to mark significant eras in human history
Base
with notable
camps.
books. At each camp,
This-
you'll find
this thing has to
generators,
be
supplies, and
enormous.
beacons to light your way.
Like
If
IKEA
you're going back
size.
far enough, you could be traveling for days or even weeks.
Wow.
Dr. Wright was fascinated by this bizarre location.
That is
Containing the
fascinating.
sum total of human experience
you
within its
imagine?
massively expanding walls. But there was one thing he couldn't figure out.
Yeah.
Just why was this seemingly harmless location featuring constantly changing books the most securely guarded SCP he had ever encountered?
Well, I mean,
Dr. Henriks knew he was referring to the extensive rules he must have seen as he entered. The elder doctor reached into his pocket and said,
that would give people
"Let's
05
just say
access
that
too.
around here, the pen is mightier than the sword."
Yeah.
He pressed the pen
I mean,
into Dr. Wright's
you would
hand
know
and flipped
everything.
open the back page
You could
of
find
his
out the
book.
details of anything.
It was
like
blank.
that.
The
It's
rest of his
crazy.
story waiting to be written. What's something you've always wanted in your life, Dr. Wright?
Oh my.
Think literally.
Oh.
Why not put it in your book or remove something you've always wanted gone.
Oh.
Slowly, Dr. Wright thought back to his teenage years.
Now I
He
understand.
recalled an injury that he suffered in a mugging that damaged his leg and left him with a limp. He nervously
So
used
you
the
can
pen to scribble out the
actually
words and
alter
sentences
history
describing the event.
Of someone's
After a
life.
few seconds, he felt a headache and suffered from a slight nosebleed. After that, the limp and pain from the injury was gone, and he could no longer recall.
Dang.
see,
I
Dr.
thought it was for
That's
privacy.
the secret of SCP-4001.
It's crazy.
Henrik said with a mad gleam in his eye.
Anything that
This
you
library
wish
doesn't
to
just
happen
let
to
us
anyone,
read the history of humanity.
it lets you write
It
it.
lets us write it.
Holy
That's why
crap.
you're here, to test the limit of this power and see what this
Oh
library can
my
do
God.
for the Foundation. Dr. Henrik soon provided Dr. Wright with footage of some
I
of the
wish
many tests conducted
everybody
in the library.
that watched my
And what
videos would
Dr. Wright
subscribe
saw
to me and
amazed
give me a
him.
thumbs up.
The books could rewrite
Tell
the
me
laws
if it
of
worked in
nature
the comments,
with alarming
guys.
speed, as some unfortunate D-class personnel found out. D-0546 was brought
Okay.
into a room with a full head of
Oh,
hair. The
D-class testing.
personnel
This is
was
going to be
instructed
good.
to scribble "lost all hair" into his book, and he
Okay.
soon started scratching his head as he rapidly started shedding hair.
Wow.
After less than 2 minutes, the man was completely bald.
Wow.
D-0567,
You saw he was bleeding
a
a little
young
bit?
woman who had been brutally injured when attacked by an escaping SCP, was bedridden and would never walk again,
Right.
according to all the Foundation doctors. As the D-class personnel used a pen to scribble over the line in her book describing her injury, Dr. Wright watched as she suffered a minor nosebleed and then sat up, getting out of bed as if she had never been
Wow.
injured.
Can you
and no longer
imagine?
remembered being attacked.
I wish I would have never
Dr.
smoked
Claire Williams,
cigarettes.
a Foundation researcher sick with cancer, wrote into the book about curing her symptoms.
I wish
and then
I would've
addressed
worked
the
out a
camera
lot as a
explaining that this
teenager.
was her third time altering her own book.
Got fit,
Her lymphoma
exercise.
symptoms had returned after several months and 2 years, respectively.
I wish
But
I'd
it
never
seemed
got
that as
gray
long
hair.
as she continued to make changes to her
It's okay.
book,
Salt and pepper
then
salt.
she could keep the cancer at bay indefinitely.
Wow.
But not all the tests ended with positive results.
Uh-oh.
As Dr. Wright moved on to another selection of tapes labeled
Mortality
tests.
tests.
A D-class personnel who was given a fatal dose of drugs and then had their death erased from their book 45 minutes later miraculously returned to life, but showed significant cognitive deficits.
Resurrection.
Another D-class, an older woman killed in a containment breach, had her death erased from the book, but came back deeply disturbed. She
I
survived
would
15 days in
imagine.
containment, repeating, "Send me back, let me go,"
Whoa.
over and over again before committing suicide. A D-class personnel killed 28 days prior was brought back by writing returned back to life in their book.
Okay.
But died again just 13 minutes later from a cerebral hemorrhage.
I take back some of those history things I tried to rewrite,
It was the next
guys.
tape that was the most disturbing. It documented a new book that was written by the Foundation, depicting the life of a fictional man down to the slightest detail.
Right.
It was carefully placed in the correct position in the archives, resembling all the other books. And Dr. Wright watched the tape in amazement as the man resembling the fictional character created for the book spontaneously generated an SCP-4001. Almost immediately, the man started vomiting blood and died less than 2 minutes later. The book carefully described all the things he died from, and stated that this was exactly as it was supposed to be.
Why?
The fake book then disappeared into the archives, never to be seen again.
Dude.
The archive knew when it was being used to play with life and death.
Yeah.
It didn't want any part of it. The next tape wasn't a test at all.
That's so scary.
It was a video interview showing a Greek-speaking scientist speaking with an ancient-looking old man.
Okay.
Found living in the archives slowly after its discovery by the Foundation. The man, who described himself as the Watcher of Alexandria Eternal, believed he was keeping the archives safe from the Roman Empire and the other invaders.
Right.
He was unaware that thousands of years had passed since his watch began. He had been using the books to write himself another day of life, and to cure his ills ever since he began guarding the library.
I see.
At the conclusion of the interview,
So he can
asked
continue to
leave,
guard it.
and this request was granted by the Foundation. The ancient man died of old age shortly after setting foot out of the library.
Wow. Because they're
While
keeping
the library
track of
can't
it now.
technically cure death, it does seem to have nearly limitless ability
That's
to
crazy.
prolong life.
Can you
As long
imagine
as someone is willing to stay close by and
changing
never forgets
history,
to
y'all?
write themselves another day.
Like
Where
if
did this
Kennedy would have
incredible
never got
power come
shot.
from? An 05
Or if the
authorized
Constitution was never
investigation
written in
into
the
the
US.
origins of SCP-4001 revealed that under the archive's carpet is a concrete floor covered by a layer of ash. The ash was carbon dated to between 70 and 80,000 years old. And further analysis revealed the ash is likely to be the remains of burnt wood and paper.
Okay.
Despite there being no known records within the archive itself about a major fire having occurred there. Dr. Wright didn't have much time to dwell on the library's great power of life, because he was suddenly shaken from his thoughts by the sound of alarms. Was the library being breached? No, it was Foundation officials, led by a man recognized as Dr. Lincoln Abrams,
Okay.
the very man who assigned him to this project.
Right.
And he did not look happy.
What
He
happened?
explained that he knew what Dr. Waylon Henricks had been up to, writing in books, changing the lives of subordinates in an attempt to play God. He knew about everything, of course, because he had read Dr. Henricks' own book. He knew all of the Doctor's secrets. He knew everything.
Waylon was...
I'm so close, Dr. Abrams. I know I can crack the archive's rules. There's a way to conquer death here. I can feel it.
No.
Dr. Abrams was done
He got
listening,
corrupt.
and with a
He
wave
got
of
too
his
hungry,
hand,
boy.
Foundation security took Dr. Henricks into custody for a debriefing and likely demotion. Dr. Abrams then turned his attention to the new young researcher. Dr. Wright. Eventful
So,
first day, I gather.
Dr. Wright-
I'll appoint a new lead scientist shortly.
Yeah.
But until then,
Oh.
don't disrupt
I
anything.
thought he was appointed.
Remember, the
Well, that's why
archive
he
is
pulled him
writing
in.
our stories as we speak. It's not very happy with Dr. Henricks.
Yeah.
Make sure your story turns out better.
Okay.
And with that, Dr. Abrams and his security team
Dude,
departed,
what?
leaving Dr. Herman
A
Wright alone with
huge
the endless archives
project,
of
huh?
Alexandria Eternal, wondering what would be written in his own tome, as the sound of new books popping into existence filled the air with ominous rustling.
Wow. That was really cool. The possibilities of changing drastic things in history, guys. You know, the way that the world would be affected, kind of like the butterfly effect, if historical events were changed for the better. Like if Adolf Hitler would have tripped and fell and died in his teenage years before he ended up, you know, taking all those lives and getting the power. And I could think of so many great things that can be done, but what would be the consequences? Would they actually be worse than what already happened? I'd love to hear your feedback on this, guys. SCP Explained, very, very, very cool SCP. Make sure to check them out, guys, and another couple SCP Explained reactions that I think you'll love. Thanks so much for watching. As always, this is Zueljin signing off. We'll see you next time.